The morning sun cut through the courthouse windows in sharp angles, illuminating dust particles that drifted like ash through the crowded lobby. Harlan Vickers shuffled forward in a line of defendants, his worn boots making barely a whisper against the polished marble floor. The shoes had once been military issue, their leather cracked now from years of weather and wear, the soles thin enough that he could feel every groove in the stone beneath his feet. Around him, people pulled their belongings closer. A woman in a pressed business suit shifted her purse to her far shoulder as Harlan passed. Two men in khakis and polo shirts exchanged glances, their noses wrinkling at the smell that followed him. That particular scent of someone who slept rough, who washed in public restrooms when he could, whose clothes held the memory of too many nights under highway overpasses. Harlan kept his eyes forward. His face was weathered like old leather left too long in the sun, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth. His hair, more gray than the brown it had once been, hung past his collar in tangles that no amount of finger-combing could tame. His beard grew in patches, unkempt but not wild, and his hands, clasped loosely before him, bore the calluses and scars of a life lived hard. The bailiff at the security checkpoint, a heavy-set man named Dennis Morrow, waved him through the metal detector with barely a glance. Process another one. Check another box. Harlan had nothing to set off the alarm anyway. No keys, no phone, no wallet, just the clothes on his back and a small paper envelope containing his court summons, creased for being folded and unfolded too many times. Behind him, a younger man complained loudly to his companion. They couldn't believe they had to wait in the same line as people like that. The companion agreed, his voice carrying across the lobby. Taxpayer money wasted on processing vagrants. Harlan's shoulders remained straight, his posture correct despite everything. Old habits died hard, and some things the body remembered even when the mind tried to forget. The courtroom itself was on the third floor. Harlan took the stairs because the elevator was too crowded, too close, too many people pressed together in a small space. His breathing stayed even as he climbed, his pace steady. Another remnant from before, when conditioning meant something, when being able to move quickly and quietly could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen how veterans are treated in your community. The hallway outside Courtroom 4C held its own collection of defendants and their families, a mixture of anxiety and resignation hanging in the air like humidity. Harlan found an empty section of bench near the far wall and sat, his back straight despite the fatigue that pulled at his bones. He'd been awake since before dawn, the cold finally driving him from his spot behind the warehouse where he usually slept. Winter was coming early this year. A court officer emerged from the double doors, a woman named Paulette Grimes whose tight bun and severe expression suggested she'd been disappointed by humanity one too many times. She called names from a clipboard, her voice sharp and impatient. When she reached Harlan's name, she looked up and scanned the hallway until her eyes landed on him. Her lip curled slightly, a micro-expression of distaste, so quick that someone not watching carefully might have missed it. Harlan Vickers, she called again, louder this time, as if volume might compensate for his appearance. Harlan stood and moved toward her. "Here, ma'am," he said quietly. Grimes looked him up and down, her assessment taking no more than 3 seconds. "Trespassing and loitering," she said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of what she already knew about men like him. "You're up after the domestic case. Wait inside." The courtroom was smaller than Harlan had expected, with wooden benches that had been worn smooth by decades of nervous hands and shifting bodies. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, flanked by the flags of the United States and the state. To the left, a court reporter's station stood empty, waiting for the day's proceedings to begin. To the right, the jury box, in use today, bore the same polished wood as everything else. Harlan took a seat in the back row. Other defendants filtered in, some with lawyers who whispered instructions and reassurances, others alone like him. A public defender would be assigned, the notice had said. Someone would speak for him, even if he had little to say for himself. The prosecutor arrived first, a man in his early 40s named Vincent Ashcroft, whose tailored suit and confident stride marked him as someone accustomed to winning. He carried a slim briefcase and moved with the efficiency of a person who had performed these same actions hundreds of times before. He barely glanced at the defendants, his attention already on the documents he pulled from his case. Then came the defense attorney, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 2 years out of law school. Her name was Iris Cantrell, and she approached Harlan with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Vickers," she said, extending her hand. Harlan stood again and shook her hand gently. "Ma'am," he replied. They went over the charges in whispers. Trespassing on restricted municipal property. Loitering. The property in question was a small park near the river, technically closed after sunset. Harlan had been found there at 3 in the morning, sleeping on a bench near the war memorial. The officer who discovered him had been kind enough, all things considered, but the law was the law. Cantrell asked if he had anywhere else to go. Harlan shook his head. She asked if he had any family who could speak on his behalf. Another shake. She made notes on her legal pad, her pen moving quickly across the yellow paper. They would argue hardship, she said. They would ask for leniency. Community service perhaps, or time served if he'd spent the night in jail. He'd spent that night in jail. The cell had been warm at least, and they'd given him a sandwich. "All rise," called Bailiff Raymond Kessler as the judge entered from his chambers. Judge Theodore Brennan entered with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path for 30 years. His black robe settled around him as he took his seat, and his gray hair, thinning at the crown, caught the overhead lights. His face bore the deep lines of a man who had seen enough of human nature to understand its complexities without becoming cynical. He was 68 years old, though he carried himself like someone a decade younger. The courtroom settled into that particular silence that comes from collective respect and fear of authority. Harlan watched the judge arrange papers on his bench, noting the careful precision of each movement. There was something familiar in that economy of motion, something that tugged at the edges of memory. "Be seated," Judge Brennan said, his voice carrying easily through the small space without needing to be raised. The morning docket began with a domestic dispute case, a husband and wife who couldn't meet each other's eyes as their lawyers spoke for them. Harlan listened without meaning to, the words washing over him like background noise. He'd learned long ago how to be present while keeping his mind elsewhere, a survival skill from nights when sleep meant vulnerability. Bailiff Kessler stood near the side door, his posture military straight, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced awareness of someone trained to spot trouble before it started. He was perhaps 50, with iron gray hair cut high and tight, and hands that rested casually near his belt but could move with speed if needed. Once, during the domestic case, his gaze passed over Harlan and something flickered across his face. Recognition perhaps, or curiosity. Then it was gone. The domestic case concluded with a restraining order and mandated counseling. The couple left through separate doors, their lawyers trailing behind with briefcases and tired expressions. Judge Brennan made notes, signed documents that the clerk brought forward, and then looked up to survey the remaining defendants. "Next case," he said. The clerk, a thin man named Morton Webb, who had been handling paperwork with the speed of long practice, consulted his list. "The State versus Harlan Vickers," Webb announced. "Charges of criminal trespassing and loitering on municipal property." Iris Cantrell stood, gesturing for Harlan to join her at the defense table. He rose and moved forward, aware of every eye in the courtroom tracking his progress. His boots made soft sounds against the floor. Someone in the gallery behind him whispered something that ended in a barely suppressed laugh. Prosecutor Ashcroft stood as well, his expression neutral, but his body language suggesting this was routine, mechanical, nothing worthy of special attention. He glanced at Harlan once, taking in the unwashed clothes and unkempt appearance, and something in his face hardened. These cases were simple, clear-cut, a waste of the court's time, really, but necessary to maintain order. "Mr. Vickers," Judge Brennan said, looking directly at Harlan for the first time. "You understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Harlan replied. His voice was quiet but steady, the words clearly enunciated despite the roughness that came from too many cold nights and not enough water. "How do you plead?" Cantrell started to speak, but Harlan was already answering. "Guilty, Your Honor. I was where they said I was." Cantrell touched his arm gently, a silent request to let her handle this. Judge Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. The courtroom had gone quiet again, but this was a different silence, one edged with interest. "Your Honor," Cantrell began, her voice gaining strength as she found her rhythm, "my client does not dispute the facts of the case. However, we ask the court to consider the circumstances. Mr. Vickers is homeless and was simply seeking shelter for the night. The location, while technically restricted after hours, is a public park. There was no damage to property, no threatening behavior, no." Prosecutor Ashcroft stood. "Your Honor, if I may, the law is clear on this matter. The park in question closes at sunset. Signs are posted. This is not Mr. Vickers's first citation for similar offenses. He has received warnings before." Judge Brennan held up a hand, and Ashcroft sat down. "First citation," the judge corrected, looking at the file before him. "The previous incidents you mentioned were warnings, not formal charges. This is his first appearance in court on these matters." Ashcroft nodded, but his expression suggested this was a technicality rather than a meaningful distinction. "The pattern of behavior remains, Your Honor. We have limited shelter resources in this city, and while we sympathize with Mr. Vickers' situation, the law must be applied equally. We cannot have individuals deciding for themselves which public spaces they can occupy after hours." From somewhere in the gallery, a voice muttered agreement. Court Officer Grimes, stationed near the gallery entrance, nodded almost imperceptibly. Her earlier assessment of Harlan had clearly not changed. "Just another vagrant clogging up the system," her expression said. Judge Brennan turned his attention back to Cantrell. "Does your client wish to make a statement?" Cantrell looked at Harlan, who had remained standing throughout, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He met the judge's eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, some unspoken communication that made the judge's expression shift almost imperceptibly. "Your Honor," Harlan said slowly, "I don't mean to cause trouble. I know the rules. I was just tired, and the bench was there, and the memorial, it seemed like a good place to rest." "The memorial," Judge Brennan repeated. "You were sleeping near the war memorial, specifically?" "Yes, sir. It felt right somehow." Judge Brennan studied Harlan more carefully now, his eyes moving from the worn boots to the weathered face to the hands that bore scars and calluses. "Tell me, Mr. Vickers, did you serve?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Cantrell looked surprised, clearly not having explored this line of inquiry in their brief consultation. Ashcroft shifted in his seat, impatient with what seemed like an irrelevant tangent. "I did, Your Honor," Harlan said simply. "What branch?" "Army, sir." Judge Brennan nodded slowly, and Bailiff Kessler's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his attention now fully focused on Harlan. The judge made a note on his pad, then looked up again. "When did you serve, Mr. Vickers?" "Long time ago, Your Honor." Harlan's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if the question had pulled him somewhere else entirely. "Another life. Be specific, please." 1978 through 2004, sir. 26 years. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively, even those who had been whispering before. 26 years was not a casual commitment. That was a career. That was a life dedicated to service. Even Prosecutor Ashcroft's expression had shifted to something less certain. Judge Brennan set down his pen and folded his hands on the bench before him. 26 years is significant service, Mr. Vickers. What was your rank at discharge? Harlan hesitated, and in that pause, something heavy settled over the courtroom. Master Sergeant, Your Honor. E8. That drew a visible reaction from Bailiff Kessler, whose jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Reaching E8 required not just time, but demonstrated leadership and competence. It was not a rank given lightly. Even some of the gallery observers who had been dismissive earlier exchanged uncertain glances. Prosecutor Ashcroft cleared his throat. Your Honor, while we certainly respect Mr. Vickers' service to our country, it doesn't change the facts of the current case. The charges before us are straightforward, and I'll determine what's relevant in my courtroom. Mr. Ashcroft, Judge Brennan said quietly, but with enough steel in his voice that the prosecutor sat back down immediately. The judge returned his attention to Harlan. What did you do in the Army, Master Sergeant? Different things over the years, Your Honor. Harlan's answers were coming slower now, each word measured as if he were navigating a minefield. Started as infantry, moved into other specialties later. What kind of specialties? The kind I can't talk much about, sir. The courtroom went utterly silent. Even court reporter Marlene Cho, who had been typing steadily throughout the proceedings, her fingers dancing across the stenotype machine with practiced efficiency, paused to look up at Harlan. She was a small woman in her 50s, Korean-American, with reading glasses perched on her nose and an expression that suggested she'd heard everything in her 20 years on the job. But this had caught her attention. Classified operations, Judge Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Some of them. Yes, sir. Judge Brennan made another note, and the scratch of his pen seemed loud in the silence. Prosecutor Ashcroft shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to object but uncertain of the grounds. This wasn't how these cases usually went. Trespassing charges were supposed to be simple. 5 minutes, maybe 10, then on to the next case. Your Honor, Cantrell said, sensing an opportunity, my client's service record demonstrates a lifetime of following orders and respecting authority. His current circumstances are the result of struggles that many veterans face upon returning to civilian life. He wasn't causing trouble at the memorial. He was simply seeking a safe place to rest, perhaps near something that reminded him of his years of service. That's speculation, Ashcroft interjected. And again, sympathetic as the story may be, it doesn't excuse breaking clearly posted regulations. Mr. Ashcroft, Judge Brennan said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested his patience was thinning, I'm going to ask you to hold your objections until I request them. He turned back to Harlan. Master Sergeant Vickers, why were you at the memorial specifically? There are other places in the city, other parks, other benches. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. The memorial lists names, Your Honor. People I knew. People who didn't make it back. I like to visit sometimes. Remind myself why I did what I did. The weight of those words settled over the courtroom like morning frost. Court Officer Grimes, who had been standing with her arms crossed and an expression of barely concealed contempt, slowly lowered her arms. Her face didn't soften exactly, but something in her posture shifted, becoming less aggressive, more uncertain. From the gallery, someone coughed. A woman in the second row, who had earlier pulled her purse away from Harlan in the lobby, stared at her hands. The two men in polo shirts, who had complained about taxpayer money, had gone very quiet. Your Honor, if I may, Ashcroft tried again, his voice less certain now, but still pressing forward. We have a witness who can testify to the circumstances of Mr. Vickers' arrest. Officer Dwayne Pritchard of the Municipal Police Department. He was the responding officer who found the defendant. Call him, Judge Brennan said. Officer Pritchard entered through the side door, a young patrolman, maybe 30 at most, with a fresh haircut and a uniform pressed to sharp creases. He took the stand and was sworn in, his hands steady on the Bible, his voice clear. Yes, he would tell the truth. Ashcroft stood and approached the witness stand. Officer Pritchard, can you describe the circumstances under which you encounter the defendant? Pritchard glanced at Harlan, and something in his expression suggested discomfort with his role here. I was on patrol in Sector 7, which includes Riverside Park. Around 3 a.m. on the night in question, I did a routine check of the park, which is closed from sunset to sunrise. I found the defendant sleeping on a bench near the war memorial. I attempted to wake him, and when he didn't respond immediately, I called for backup as a precaution. Did he respond when you finally roused him? Yes, sir. He was cooperative. Disoriented at first, like someone waking from deep sleep, but once he understood what was happening, he complied with all instructions. Did he resist in any way? No, sir. He didn't resist at all. Did he have any weapons or contraband? No, sir. He had nothing but the clothes he was wearing and the court summons from a previous warning. Ashcroft nodded. And you've patrolled that area before? Many times, sir. Have you encountered Mr. Vickers there on previous occasions? Twice before, sir. Both times I issued warnings and asked him to move along, which he did without incident. Thank you, officer. Ashcroft returned to his seat, looking satisfied. The pattern was established. Repeat offender. Clear violation of posted rules. Judge Brennan gestured to Cantrell. Do you wish to cross-examine? Cantrell stood, smoothing her skirt. Officer Pritchard, when you encountered Mr. Vickers, was he causing any disturbance? No, ma'am. He was sleeping. Was there any damage to park property? None that I observed. Any evidence of alcohol or drug use? No, ma'am. You mentioned he was disoriented when you first tried to wake him. Could you elaborate on that? Pritchard shifted in his seat. He seemed to be somewhere else when I first called to him. It took several attempts to get his attention. When he did wake up, he looked around like he wasn't sure where he was. Then he seemed to recognize the memorial, and he relaxed. Did he say anything about the memorial? He apologized for falling asleep. Said he'd been visiting the names and must have dozed off. He asked if he could finish paying his respects before he left. And did you allow that? Pritchard nodded slowly. I did, ma'am. It seemed important to him. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just looking at the wall. Then he turned around and put his hands out for the cuffs without me having to ask. The courtroom had become a held breath. Everyone suspended in this moment of testimony that painted a picture so different from what they'd expected. This wasn't a defiant vagrant or a nuisance to be processed and dismissed. This was something else entirely, something that made easy judgment suddenly complicated. Thank you, officer, Cantrell said quietly and sat down. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his attention fixed on Harlan with an intensity that seemed to bore through the defense table. Master Sergeant Vickers, he said slowly, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Harlan met the judge's gaze steadily, waiting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a constant drone that filled the silence. Outside the tall windows, clouds moved across the sky, casting shifting shadows through the courtroom. What unit were you with during your classified operations? Judge Brennan asked. And I'm not asking you to violate any security protocols. Just the unit designation if you're able to share it. Harlan's jaw tightened. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then, quietly, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, Your Honor. For 12 years. The effect was immediate and electric. Bailiff Kessler's eyes widened, and his hand moved unconsciously to attention position before he caught himself. Delta Force. The most elite special operations unit in the military. Soldiers who operated in the shadows, whose missions were rarely acknowledged, whose very existence was often classified. Prosecutor Ashcroft had gone very still. Whatever he'd been expecting when he'd pulled this file that morning, it wasn't this. Court Officer Grimes looked like she'd been struck. Her earlier contempt had vanished entirely, replaced by something between shock and shame. From the gallery, someone whispered Delta Force, and the words rippled through the observers like wind through grass. The woman who'd clutched her purse earlier had tears in her eyes now. The 2 men in polo shirts stared at Harlan as if seeing him for the first time. Judge Brennan nodded slowly, his expression grave. And after Delta, Master Sergeant? Instructor at Fort Bragg for 3 years. Then medical retirement in 2004. Medical retirement, the judge repeated. Combat-related injuries? Among other things, sir. Harlan's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. The body heals better than the mind sometimes. PTSD, Cantrell said softly, understanding flooding her face. She looked at her notes, at the bare facts she'd written down, and realized how little she'd actually understood about her client. Why didn't you tell me this before? Harlan turned to her, and his eyes held a weariness that went bone deep. Because it doesn't change anything, ma'am. I was still where I wasn't supposed to be. The law doesn't care what I used to do. But it does matter, Cantrell insisted. Your service, your sacrifice, the struggles you've faced since leaving the military, all of this is relevant to understanding your circumstances. Ashcroft finally found his voice. Your Honor, with all due respect to Master Sergeant Vickers's distinguished service, Miss Cantrell is correct that these are mitigating factors we should consider. However, the defendant's own words acknowledge his guilt. Perhaps we could move toward a resolution that takes his background into account while still addressing the violation. Judge Brennan didn't seem to hear him. He was still focused on Harlan, his expression unreadable but intense. How long have you been homeless, Master Sergeant? For years, Your Honor. Maybe 5. Hard to keep exact track after a while. And in that time, you've been arrested for trespassing how many times? Just warnings before, sir. This is the first formal charge. But you keep going back to that memorial. Yes, sir. Why that one specifically? Judge Brennan leaned forward. There are other memorials in the city. Other places that honor service members. Harlan was quiet again. That same careful consideration before speaking. Because 3 of my men are on that wall, Your Honor. 3 men I led into a situation I couldn't lead them out of. Their families live in this area. I figure someone should visit them, should remember. I'm all they've got left from the unit. The courtroom had become a church, silent and reverent. Court reporter Cho had stopped typing altogether, her hands resting on her machine, her eyes fixed on Harlan. Even Judge Brennan seemed affected, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing on what he'd just heard. Officer Pritchard, still seated in the witness box, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, when I arrested Master Sergeant Vickers, I didn't know his background. If I had known, I'm not sure I would have. He trailed off, uncertain how to finish that sentence without suggesting he'd violate protocol. You would have done your duty, officer, Judge Brennan said firmly. As you should. The law applies to everyone equally, regardless of service or sacrifice. He paused, then added, but understanding context helps us apply that law with wisdom rather than mere enforcement. Ashcroft stood again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. Your Honor, perhaps we could discuss a plea arrangement. Community service, mandatory counseling, assistance with securing veteran services. We're not looking to punish Master Sergeant Vickers. We simply need to establish that the law has meaning. Before the judge could respond, Harlan spoke. I don't want special treatment, Your Honor. I broke the rules. I knew they were there. If there's a fine, I can't pay it, but I'll accept whatever sentence you think is appropriate. Cantrell put a hand on his arm, a gentle pressure asking him to stop talking, to let her do her job. But Harlan had said his piece. Judge Brennan sat back his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Master Sergeant Vickers, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. During your time with Delta, did you ever operate in Southeast Asia? Specifically, did you participate in any operations in or around Cambodia between 1995 and 97? The question landed like a mortar round. Harlan's face went completely blank, the careful neutral expression of someone who'd been trained to reveal nothing. The judge's specificity was too precise to be accidental. This wasn't a random question. This was something else. Sir, Harlan said slowly, you know I can't answer questions about specific operations. Most of what I did remains classified. I understand, Judge Brennan said, but I'm asking anyway. And I'm asking in this courtroom, on the record, because I believe your answer may be relevant to these proceedings. Cantrell looked confused, clearly not following the connection. Ashcroft frowned, equally lost. But Bailiff Kessler had gone very still, his eyes moving between the judge and Harlan, as if he were witnessing something significant, something that transcended the ordinary business of the court. Harlan's hands, which had remained steady throughout the entire proceeding, trembled slightly. Your Honor, I'm not sure what you're asking me to confirm. Judge Brennan's voice softened. I'm asking if you were part of a team that extracted 3 humanitarian workers from a hostile situation near the Thai-Cambodian border in December of 1996. I'm asking if you spent 4 days behind enemy lines, evading capture, keeping those civilians alive against impossible odds. I'm asking if you're the Master Sergeant Vickers whose actions saved lives, including the life of a young Army lieutenant who was coordinating air support for your extraction. The courtroom seemed to tilt. Every person present felt the weight of the moment, even those who didn't fully understand what was being said. This wasn't just about a homeless veteran sleeping in a park anymore. This was about something much larger, much more profound. Harlan's eyes locked with the judge's, and in that gaze passed understanding, recognition, and the weight of shared experience. "Sir," he said quietly, "I was part of that operation. But I wasn't alone. I had a good team. We all did our jobs." Judge Brennan stood slowly, his black robe falling around him like wings. The entire courtroom rose with him automatically, conditioned response to judicial authority. But the judge wasn't focused on procedure. His attention was entirely on Harlan. "Master Sergeant Vickers," Judge Brennan said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held before, "I was that lieutenant. I was one of the 3 people your team pulled out of that jungle." The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. No one moved. No one breathed. The revelation was so unexpected, so cinematically perfect, that it seemed almost impossible. Yet the truth of it was written across both men's faces, in a recognition that had been building since the judge first heard Harlan's name spoken aloud in his courtroom. Harlan remained standing, his weathered face betraying no emotion, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen too much and carried too many memories, glistened slightly in the fluorescent light. "Sir," he said quietly, "you don't need to. I do need to." Judge Brennan interrupted, his own voice thick with emotion. "I need to because this court, this community, everyone in this room needs to understand who you are. What you've done. What you sacrificed. Your honor," Ashcroft said weakly, standing but seeming uncertain whether he should even be speaking. "This is highly irregular." "Sit down, Mr. Ashcroft," the judge said without looking at him. The prosecutor sat. Judge Brennan came down from the bench, moving around it with deliberate steps, his robe swishing softly. Bailiff Kessler moved instinctively to intercede, trained to keep distance between the judge and defendants, but Brennan waved him off. The bailiff stepped back, though his eyes never left the scene unfolding before him. The judge approached Harlan directly, stopping just a few feet away. Court Officer Grimes had tears running down her face now, her hand covering her mouth. Court reporter Cho had abandoned all pretense of documenting the proceedings, simply watching with wide eyes as history wrote itself in real time. December of 1996, Judge Brennan began, his voice steady but filled with the weight of memory. "I was a first lieutenant, 26 years old, assigned to coordinate support for humanitarian operations near the border. We'd gone in with a small team, 2 aid workers from an NGO and myself, to assess conditions in a refugee camp. We were supposed to be there for 6 hours. We were supposed to be safe." Harlan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "The camp was overrun by hostile forces," Judge Brennan continued. "We escaped into the jungle, but we had no weapons, no communication equipment, nothing but the clothes on our backs. We ran for 2 days. We were being hunted. I'd never been so terrified in my life. Then, on the 3rd night, when we thought we couldn't run anymore, when we were certain we'd be captured or killed, you appeared. The gallery was utterly silent. Even the usual ambient sounds of the courthouse, the distant footsteps and closing doors, seemed to have ceased. The entire building was holding its breath. 8 of you," Brennan said. 8 ghosts moving through the jungle, like you were part of it. You found us, gave us water, gave us food. The aid workers were injured. One had a broken leg from falling during our escape. You carried her. For 2 days, through enemy territory, you carried her while your team kept us alive." "Sir," Harlan said softly, "that was the mission. That's what we trained for." "No," Brennan shook his head. "What you trained for was extraction. Quick in, quick out. But the extraction point was compromised. The helicopters couldn't land. So you kept us alive for 4 days instead of 4 hours. You made that decision, Master Sergeant. You could have left us. You could have saved yourselves. But you didn't." "We don't leave people behind," Harlan replied. And in those 5 words was the essence of everything he'd ever been, everything he'd ever believed in. Judge Brennan's eyes were wet now, unashamed tears tracking down his face. "You were hit on the 4th day. I saw it happen. We were pinned down, taking fire from 3 directions. You were moving to get us better cover, and you took rounds to your shoulder and leg. You didn't stop. You kept moving, kept fighting, kept leading until that helicopter finally came. Harlan's hand moved unconsciously to his left shoulder, where the old wounds lived beneath his worn shirt. Scars that ached in cold weather. Reminders of choices made in milliseconds that carried consequences for decades. I put you in for Silver Star, Brennan said. I wrote the recommendation myself, but it disappeared into the classification machinery. Most of your operations did. The missions that mattered most are the ones no one can ever know about. That's how it works, sir, Harlan said. We knew that going in. But it's not right. Brennan's voice rose slightly, passion breaking through judicial restraint. It's not right that you saved my life, that you saved 3 lives, that you spent 12 years running missions that kept this country safe, and now you're standing in my courtroom charged with trespassing because you have nowhere else to sleep. The judge's words echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Prosecutor Ashcroft had his head bowed, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like a costume. Court Officer Grimes had composed herself somewhat, but her face remained flushed with shame at how she'd treated Harlan, how she'd looked at him with contempt when he was more deserving of honor than anyone in the building. Cantrell was crying openly, tears streaming down her young face as she realized how close she'd come to letting her client plead guilty to charges that now seemed not just wrong but obscene. She'd been ready to negotiate a plea deal, to accept community service, to treat this like any other case. The weight of what she'd almost missed pressed down on her shoulders. Your Honor, Harlan said, and his voice carried a gentle firmness. What happened in Cambodia was a long time ago. I'm grateful I could help. I'm grateful you made it home. But that doesn't change what I did 3 nights ago. I was in that park after hours. The law says that's not allowed. I broke that law. The fact that I did my job 29 years ago doesn't give me the right to ignore the rules now. Judge Brennan stared at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, some understanding that transcended words. The judge recognized in Harlan's response the same integrity, the same adherence to principle that had kept 3 people alive in a jungle decades ago. This man didn't want special treatment. This man wanted to be held to the same standard as everyone else, even when that standard felt unjust given his circumstances. Master Sergeant, the judge said slowly, the law may be the law, but justice requires wisdom in its application. And I'll be damned if I'm going to punish the man who saved my life for seeking shelter near a memorial to his fallen brothers. He turned and walked back to the bench, his robes sweeping behind him. The courtroom remained standing, no one certain whether they should sit until instructed. Judge Brennan didn't sit either. He stood behind the bench, his hands resting on the dark wood, and looked out at the assembled people. This court is going to take a recess, he announced. 30 minutes. When we reconvene, I expect the prosecution to be prepared to discuss alternative resolutions to this case. He looked directly at Ashcroft. I also expect representatives from the Veterans Affairs Office to be present. Bailiff Kessler, make those calls. Yes, Your Honor, Kessler replied, already moving toward the phone on his desk. Master Sergeant Vickers, you're to remain in the courtroom. Miss Cantrell, stay with your client. Everyone else, 30 minutes. Court Officer Grimes stepped forward, her voice surprisingly gentle. Master Sergeant, can I get you some water? Coffee? Water will be fine, ma'am, Harlan said. Thank you. She nodded and left quickly, almost fleeing, her earlier contempt transformed into something like reverence. The courtroom emptied slowly, observers filing out in clusters, their conversations hushed and reverent. The 2 men in polo shirts who'd complained about taxpayer money lingered near the door, looking back at Harlan with expressions that mixed shame and awe. The woman who'd clutched her purse approached Cantrell instead, too intimidated to speak directly to Harlan, and asked if there was anything she could do to help. Cantrell, still processing everything herself, said she'd let her know. Harlan sat at the defense table, his hands folded on the polished wood surface. Court Officer Grimes returned with a bottle of water, cold from the break room refrigerator, and set it before him with a carefulness that bordered on ceremony. Master Sergeant, she said quietly, I apologize for my behavior earlier. I had no idea. Ma'am, Harlan replied, looking up at her. You treated me the way things looked. No apology needed. But there is, she insisted, her voice catching. I wore the uniform too. 6 years, Army Reserve. I should have known better than to judge based on appearance. I should have recognized something. Harlan's expression softened slightly. What unit? 402nd Civil Affairs Battalion. Deployed to Iraq in Ohio. Then you know how it is when you come back, he said gently. How hard it can be to fit into the world again. How sometimes the things that helped you survive over there make it harder to survive over here. Grimes nodded, tears threatening again. She straightened, forcing herself back into professional composure. If you need anything during the recess, you let me know. After she left, Cantrell pulled her chair closer to Harlan's. I need to apologize too, she said. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't dig deep enough into your background. I almost let you plead guilty to something that, given the circumstances, should never have been charged in the first place. Miss Cantrell, Harlan said patiently, you had 20 minutes with me before the hearing. You did your job with the information you had. That's all anyone can ask. But if the judge hadn't recognized your name, if he hadn't been there in Cambodia, you would have been convicted. You have served time or paid a fine you couldn't afford. The injustice of it. She couldn't finish the sentence. That's true, Harlan acknowledged. But I've learned that life isn't fair. We do the best we can with what we're given. You did that. They sat in silence for a moment, the courtroom quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of voices from the hallway. Through the tall windows, clouds continued their slow procession across the sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Can I ask you something? Cantrell said. Why didn't you reach out to Veterans Services before? Why didn't you apply for benefits, for housing assistance, for medical care? Harlan was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the water bottle before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant. Because every time I tried, every time I walked into one of those offices and saw the lines of people waiting, people who needed help just as much as I did, I thought about the men who didn't make it back. I thought about the ones on that memorial wall. They didn't get to stand in line. They didn't get another chance. Who was I to take resources from someone else when I could manage on my own? But you weren't managing, Cantrell said softly. You were sleeping in parks, getting arrested. I was alive, Harlan replied. I was breathing. I was free to walk around and remember my friends. That seemed like enough. Before Cantrell could respond, the side door opened and Bailiff Kessler entered, followed by 2 people in business attire. The first was a woman in her 40s, with short dark hair and a briefcase that looked like it had seen considerable use. The second was a man, slightly older, with a military bearing that suggested he'd worn a uniform at some point in his life. Kessler made introductions. Master Sergeant Vickers, this is Patricia Delgado from the Veterans Affairs Office and Marcus Thornhill from the Veterans Crisis Line Coordination Center. They came as soon as I called. Delgado approached the table and extended her hand. Master Sergeant Vickers, it's an honor. Judge Brennan briefed me on your situation. We need to talk about getting you the support you've earned. Harlan shook her hand, his grip firm despite the years on the street. Ma'am, I appreciate you coming, but I don't want to take up time that could go to someone else. With respect, Master Sergeant, Thornhill interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with resistant veterans before. That's not your decision to make. The benefits exist because of people like you. Using them isn't taking from anyone. It's accepting what you're entitled to. Delgado opened her briefcase and pulled out several forms. First, we need to establish your service record officially. Do you have your DD-214? Harlan shook his head. Lost it years ago. Everything I had was in a storage unit until I couldn't pay for it anymore. They auctioned it off. That's not a problem, Delgado said, making notes. We can pull your records from the National Archives. With your service dates and social security number, we should have everything within a few days. In the meantime, we can start the emergency housing process. Emergency housing, Harlan repeated, the words seeming foreign in his mouth. Thornhill pulled out his phone and began scrolling. We have several veteran-specific facilities in the area. Clean beds, 3 meals a day, counseling services, job training if you want it. The wait list is usually 6 weeks, but given your background and Judge Brennan's involvement, I can have you placed by tonight. Tonight, Harlan said again, his voice even quieter. Cantrell noticed his hands had begun to tremble slightly. The water bottle remained unopened on the table. She recognized the signs of someone overwhelmed, someone who'd lived so long in survival mode that the prospect of stability felt threatening rather than comforting. Master Sergeant, she said gently, you don't have to decide everything right now. Let's just take it one step at a time. But Delgado was already moving forward, her efficiency born from years of bureaucratic navigation. We'll also want to get you enrolled in medical care. With your combat-related injuries and PTSD, you qualify for full coverage. That includes mental health services, which I strongly recommend you utilize. Ma'am, Harlan said, his voice taking on a strained quality, I appreciate all this, but it's a lot to process. I understand, Delgado said, but her momentum didn't slow. Time is of the essence here. The judge clearly wants to see you taken care of, and we need to demonstrate to the court that there's a comprehensive support plan in place. It's not just about resolving these charges. It's about making sure you don't end up in this situation again. Harlan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Everyone stopped talking. He walked to the window, his back to the room, his shoulders tight. Outside, the city moved through its normal rhythms, people going about their business, unaware of the small drama unfolding in courtroom 4C. Master Sergeant, Kessler said quietly, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. You okay? Harlan's reflection in the glass showed a man wrestling with something deeper than gratitude or relief. For 4 years, maybe 5, he'd survived by keeping everything simple. Find food, find shelter, stay invisible, stay safe. The world had reduced itself to basic elements, and in that reduction, there had been a strange kind of peace. Now, in the space of an hour, that simple existence was being dismantled, replaced by forms and programs and well-meaning people who wanted to help, but whose help felt like drowning. I just need a minute, Harlan said, his voice barely audible. Cantrell crossed the courtroom and stood beside Harlan at the window, not speaking, just present. Sometimes presence was enough. She'd learned that in her brief time as a public defender. Sometimes people didn't need words or solutions. They just needed someone to stand with them while they processed whatever storm was raging inside. After a long moment, Harlan spoke without turning around. Well, I got out an offer. They gave me papers. Medical discharge. Honorable. Told me about benefits, about programs, about all the things I could access. I went to a few appointments. Sat in waiting rooms. Filled out forms. But every time I did, I'd look around at the other vets waiting, and I'd see their faces. Some of them were missing limbs. Some of them had burns covering half their bodies. Some of them shook so hard they could barely hold a pen. His breath fogged the window glass slightly. And I'd think, who am I to be here? I walked out of the jungle. I came home in one piece, more or less. My wounds healed. My scars are mostly on the inside where no one could see them. So I stopped going. Figured I'd manage on my own. Figured the resources should go to people who really needed them. But you really needed them too, Cantrell said quietly. Did I? Harlan turned to face her, and his eyes held a complexity she was only beginning to understand. I had a roof over my head for a while. Rented a room. Got a job at a warehouse. Went through the motions. But every night I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, feeling like the walls were closing in, feeling like I was wasting time when I should be moving, should be on patrol, should be watching for threats. The sleep never came, and when it did, the dreams were worse than the insomnia. PTSD, Thornhill said from across the room, his voice gentle but firm. Classic symptoms. Hypervigilance, insomnia, feeling trapped in enclosed spaces. Master Sergeant, what you're describing is a medical condition, not a personal failing. I know what it is, Harlan replied. No heat in his voice, just statement of fact. I've read the literature. I've sat through the briefings. Knowing what it is doesn't make it any easier to live with. Delgado had been watching quietly, letting the moment unfold. Now, she spoke, her tone shifting from bureaucratic efficiency to something more human. Master Sergeant, may I share something with you? My father was a Marine. Vietnam. 3 tours. He came home and tried to do exactly what you did. Tough it out. Manage alone. Be strong. He lasted 15 years before he ate his service pistol in the garage. The bluntness of her words cut through the room like a blade. Cantrell flinched. Even Kessler, standing by the door, looked stricken. I was 12, Delgado continued, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was sharing. I found him, and for years afterward I was angry. Angry at him for leaving us. Angry at the Corps for breaking him. Angry at a system that let him fall through the cracks. That's why I do this work now. That's why I'm standing here, pushing these forms at you even though I can see it's overwhelming. Because I don't want another kid to find their father like I found mine. Harlan's face had gone very still, and when he spoke, his voice was thick. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. That shouldn't have happened to you. No, it shouldn't have, Delgado agreed. And whatever happens to you shouldn't happen either. You've already given enough. You've already sacrificed enough. It's time to let people help you carry the weight. The side door opened again, and Judge Brennan entered, still in his robe, his expression serious. He took in the scene, reading the tension in the room with practiced ease. I apologize for interrupting, but I wanted to check on how things were progressing before we reconvene. Your Honor, Thornhill said, we're working on establishing a comprehensive support plan for Master Sergeant Vickers. Housing, medical care, benefits coordination. It's going to take some time to implement fully, but we can have immediate steps in place today. Good, Brennan said. He looked at Harlan. Master Sergeant, I know this is a lot. I know it probably feels like everyone's making decisions for you, talking about you like you're not in the room. That's not my intent, and I don't believe it's theirs either. But I need you to understand something. When you pulled me out of that jungle, when you kept me alive for 4 days, you gave me a future. I got married. I had 3 children. I became a judge. I've served this community for 23 years. All of that exists because you decided I was worth saving. Sir, Harlan started, but Brennan held up a hand. Let me finish. You gave me a future, and now I have the opportunity to help give you one. Not repayment, because what you did can't be repaid, but reciprocity, human decency, whatever you want to call it. I'm asking you, as someone who knows what you're capable of, as someone who's seen you at your best, to accept the help being offered. Not for me, not for anyone else, for yourself. The weight of the judge's words settled over the room. Harlan stood very still, his jaw working, his eyes distant. Finally, he nodded, just once, a small movement that carried enormous significance. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I'll try. Delgado moved quickly, sensing the breakthrough, not wanting to lose momentum. Excellent. First step, let's get you enrolled in the emergency housing program. Mr. Thornhill, you said you could have placement by tonight? Already done, Thornhill replied, holding up his phone. I made the call while we were talking. There's a bed waiting at the Veterans Transition Center on Maple Street. It's a good facility. Private rooms, full services, staff trained in trauma-informed care. Private room, Harlan repeated, as if testing the words. Your own space, Thornhill confirmed. Door that locks from the inside. You control who comes and goes. I know that matters. It does, Harlan admitted. Cantrell felt something shift in her chest, a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that her client was finally accepting help. Sadness that it had taken this long, that it required this specific judge in this specific courtroom for the system to work the way it should work for every veteran. Second step, Delgado continued. Medical evaluation within the next 72 hours. We'll set up an appointment with the VA hospital. Full physical, mental health screening, medication review if needed. You'll be assigned a case manager who will coordinate all your care. Will I have to stay there? Harlan asked. At the hospital? Not unless you want it, Delgado said. Most of it can be handled outpatient. But if you feel like you need more intensive support, that option exists too. Harlan nodded again, processing. What about the memorial? Can I still visit? Judge Brennan smiled slightly, the first smile anyone had seen from him since the proceedings began. Master Sergeant, as far as I'm concerned, you have standing permission to visit that memorial whenever you wish, day or night. I'll have it put in writing if necessary. That won't be needed, Your Honor, Harlan said. Your word is enough. Kessler cleared his throat from his position by the door. Your Honor, we're approaching the end of the recess. The prosecutor is waiting in the hallway. He asked to speak with you when you have a moment. Send him in, Brennan said. Ashcroft entered, and his demeanor had transformed completely from the confident prosecutor who'd begun the morning. He approached the judge, then turned to face Harlan directly. Master Sergeant Vickers, I need to apologize. I walked into this courtroom today thinking I was dealing with a routine trespassing case. I didn't do my due diligence. I didn't look deeper. I allowed assumptions to guide my prosecution, and that's on me. Mr. Ashcroft, Harlan said, you were doing your job. No apology needed. With respect, there is, Ashcroft insisted. Part of my job is to seek justice, not just convictions. I failed to seek justice here. He turned to Judge Brennan. Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Master Sergeant Vickers with prejudice. Judge Brennan considered the motion, though everyone in the room knew what his decision would be. Motion granted. All charges dismissed with prejudice. Master Sergeant Vickers, you're free to go. But instead of relief, those words seemed to drain something from Harlan. Free to go. He'd been free to go for 4 years. Free to go wherever his feet could carry him. Free to sleep under overpasses and behind dumpsters. Free to disappear into the anonymous mass of the forgotten. Freedom, he'd learned, was a complicated concept. Your Honor, Cantrell said, sensing Harlan's hesitation, if it pleases the court, I'd like to accompany my client to the Veterans Transition Center. Help him get settled. Make sure the intake process goes smoothly. Brennan nodded. That's a good idea, Miss Cantrell. Master Sergeant, you're in capable hands. The courtroom began to empty again as word spread that the proceedings were concluded. But this time, people didn't just file out. They lingered. Officer Pritchard, who'd been waiting in the hallway in case he was needed for further testimony, stepped inside and approached Harlan. He extended his hand, and Harlan shook it. Master Sergeant, I'm sorry I arrested you, Pritchard said. If I'd known. You did your duty, officer, Harlan interrupted gently. Nothing to apologize for. Still, Pritchard said, I like to make it right somehow. I patrol that area 3 nights a week. If you ever need anything, if you ever want company at the memorial, you let me know. I appreciate that, Harlan said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. The bailiff, Kessler, approached next. His military bearing was even more pronounced now, and when he spoke, it was with the formality of one service member addressing another. Master Sergeant Vickers, it's been an honor sharing this courtroom with you today. I serve in the 101st Airborne, 2 tours in Afghanistan. I thought I knew what sacrifice looked like, but hearing your story, understanding what you did, it puts things in perspective. Every soldier's service matters, Harlan replied. You did your part. That's what counts. Still, Kessler said, and his voice dropped lower, if you need anything at all, you call this number. He pressed a business card into Harlan's hand. Day or night? I mean that. Harlan looked at the card, then slipped it into his shirt pocket. Thank you. Court reporter Cho had been packing up her stenotype machine, but now she crossed the courtroom as well. Master Sergeant, she said, her accent carrying the slight lilt of someone who'd learned English as a second language. My father was in the Korean War. He never talked about it, but I know it stayed with him his whole life. When I heard your story today, I thought of him. I thought of all the things he probably carried that we never knew about. Thank you for your service. Thank you for still being here. Ma'am, Harlan said, clearly moved by her words. Your father's generation paved the way for all of us who came after. We stand on their shoulders. Cho smiled, tears in her eyes, and returned to her station. The courtroom was clearing now, but slowly, people taking time to acknowledge what had transpired, to recognize that they'd witnessed something rare and profound. Court Officer Grimes was the last to approach. She'd composed herself fully now, her uniform straightened, her bearing professional. But when she spoke to Harlan, her voice was soft. Master Sergeant, I made a mistake today. More than one. I judged you based on appearances. I treated you with contempt when I should have treated you with respect. That's not who I want to be. That's not who I thought I was. Harlan looked at her steadily. We all have bad days, ma'am. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. I'll do better, Grimes said firmly. I'll remember this. I'll remember you. And the next person who comes through those doors looking like they've had a hard road, I'll remember that I don't know their story until I take the time to learn it. That's all any of us can do, Harlan said. Judge Brennan had remained on the bench throughout these exchanges, watching quietly as his courtroom transformed from a place of judgment to a place of healing. Now he spoke, his voice carrying across the room. Master Sergeant Vickers, before you leave, I want to give you something. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small leather wallet, worn with age. From it, he extracted a photograph, creased and faded. He came down from the bench once more and handed it to Harlan. The photograph showed a much younger Theodore Brennan, lean and tanned, standing in jungle fatigues next to a helicopter. Behind him, barely visible in the background, were several other figures. Harlan stared at the image, and his hand trembled slightly. That was taken about an hour after you got us out, Brennan said quietly. One of the crew chiefs snapped it. I've carried it with me for 29 years. Every time I put on this robe, every time I walk into this courtroom, I remember that I'm only here because of people like you. People who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Sir, I can't take this, Harlan said, trying to hand it back. You're not taking it, Brennan replied. I'm giving it to you. Because I think maybe you need to remember too, not just the men who didn't make it back, but the ones who did. The lives you saved. The difference you made. Harlan looked at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully slipped it into his shirt pocket next to Kessler's business card. Thank you, sir. Brennan placed a hand on Harlan's shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of shared experience, of brotherhood forged in circumstances most people would never understand. When you're ready, when you're settled, I'd like you to come back, not as a defendant, as a guest. I want you to meet my wife, my children. I want them to meet the man who gave their father a future. I'd be honored, sir, Harlan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Delgado stepped forward, her briefcase in hand, all business again, but with a warmth that hadn't been there at the start. Master Sergeant, I'm going to follow up with you tomorrow at the transition center. We'll start the paperwork for your benefits, get your medical appointments scheduled. I know it seems like a lot of bureaucracy, but I promise you we'll get through it together. I believe you, ma'am, Harlan said. Thornhill added, and I'll check in as well. The transition center has my direct number. If you need anything, if you're struggling, if you just need someone to talk to who understands, you reach out. That's not just my job. That's my commitment to you. Cantrell gathered her papers and turned to Harlan. Ready? He looked around the courtroom one last time, this space that had held so much judgment and contempt just hours before, but had transformed into something else entirely. Ready, he said. They walked toward the exit together, Cantrell adjusting her pace to match his, not rushing, not pushing. Behind them, Judge Brennan watched until they disappeared through the doorway. Then he sat heavily in his chair, the weight of the morning settling on his shoulders. That was remarkable, Kessler said quietly, approaching the bench. That was overdue, Brennan corrected. That man should never have been in this courtroom in the first place. He should have been taken care of years ago. The fact that it took random chance, the fact that he happened to appear before the one judge who knew his name, that's not the system working. That's luck. But at least he's getting help now, Kessler offered. This time, Brennan agreed. But how many others like him are out there? How many other Master Sergeant Vickers are sleeping in parks and under bridges, carrying burdens we can't see, suffering in silence because they think they don't deserve help? The question hung in the air, unanswered because it was unanswerable. The courtroom fell silent again, emptied now except for the judge and his bailiff. The morning's drama concluded, but its echoes still reverberating through the space. The Veterans Transition Center sat on a quiet street 3 miles from the courthouse, a 3-story brick building that had once been an elementary school before declining enrollment forced its closure. The city had sold it to a non-profit organization that converted the classrooms into private living spaces and the gymnasium into a community center. Trees lined the street, their leaves turning gold and orange with the advancing autumn, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Cantrell pulled her car into the parking lot. Harlan sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees, watching the building through the windshield. He hadn't said much during the drive, just answered her occasional questions with brief responses. She could sense the tension in him, the way his body remained coiled despite the comfortable seat and the warm air from the heater. "This is it," Cantrell said, turning off the engine. "You ready?" Harlan nodded, but he didn't move immediately. His eyes tracked the people visible through the front windows, residents moving through the lobby, staff members at the reception desk. After a moment, he reached for the door handle. They walked together up the concrete path, past flower beds that someone had planted with late-season chrysanthemums, their yellow and burgundy blooms bright against the cooling earth. The entrance doors were glass, clean and recently washed, and they slid open automatically as Harlan and Cantrell approached. The lobby was warm and inviting, painted in soft earth tones, with comfortable chairs arranged in conversational groupings. A bulletin board on one wall advertised support groups, job training workshops, and recreational activities. A coffee station sat in the corner, the smell of fresh brew filling the air. Everything about the space seemed designed to convey safety, comfort, belonging. A man in his early 50s stood from behind a reception desk as they entered. He was built like someone who'd spent time in the military, thick through the shoulders and chest, with a buzz cut gone mostly gray and eyes that assessed quickly but not unkindly. His name tag read Marcus Chun, Director. "You must be Master Sergeant Vickers," Chun said, coming around the desk with his hand extended. Mr. Thornhill called ahead. "We've been expecting you. Welcome home." "Home." The word seemed to catch Harlan off guard. He shook Chin's hand, his grip firm. "Thank you, sir. Just Harlan is fine." Chin smiled. "And you can call me Marcus. We don't stand on much ceremony here. This is a place for healing, not formality." He turned to Cantrell. "You must be Miss Cantrell. Thank you for bringing him." "Of course," Cantrell said. "I want to make sure he got here safely." "I appreciate that," Chin said. "We'll take good care of him from here." He gestured toward the hallway. "Master Sergeant, Harlan, why don't I show you around, get you oriented, and then we'll get you settled in your room." They walked through the building, Chin narrating as they went. The first floor housed common areas. The cafeteria where 3 meals a day were served, the television lounge, the library that also served as a quiet study space, and several offices where counselors and case managers met with residents. The second floor contained individual living quarters, each room approximately 12 by 15 feet, with a bed, desk, chair, small dresser, and a window. "Every room has its own lock," Chin explained as they climbed the stairs. "You control access. No one comes in without your permission, not staff, not other residents. Privacy is important to us. We find that men who've been living on the streets need space they can truly call their own, space where they feel safe." Harlan listened without commenting, his eyes taking in everything. The fire exits, the security cameras mounted discreetly in corners, the way the hallways were laid out with clear sight lines. Old habits, always mapping escape routes, always noting potential threats. Chin showed them a vacant room on the second floor, number 23. "This is yours if you want it," he said, unlocking the door. The room was clean and simple, freshly painted in a warm beige. The bed was made with crisp, white linens. The window looked out over the back of the property, toward a small garden where several residents were working among raised beds. Harlan stepped inside slowly, his boots quiet on the thin carpet. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden, watching a man with a prosthetic leg kneeling beside a tomato plant, carefully picking ripe fruit and placing them in a basket. Another resident, older, maybe 70s, used a walker to move between the beds, checking on the various plants with the careful attention of someone who found purpose in nurturing growing things. "We encourage people to get involved in the garden if they want," Chin said. "Some guys find working with the soil helps them process things. Others prefer the workshop in the basement. We've got woodworking tools, craft supplies. Some men like to keep their hands busy." "What about rules?" Harlan asked without turning from the window. "What are the expectations?" Chun leaned against the doorframe. "Reasonable ones. No violence, no drugs or alcohol on premises, no weapons. You're expected to keep your room reasonably clean and to participate in at least 3 house meetings a week where we discuss community issues and support each other. Beyond that, this is your home. You can come and go as you please. We encourage people to engage with the services we offer, counseling and job training and medical care, but we don't force anything. This isn't a jail or a hospital. It's a transition space. You heal at your own pace. Harlan turned to face him. How long can I stay? Average residency is 6 to 9 months, Chin said. Some guys are ready to move on sooner. Some need longer. We work with each person individually. The goal isn't to get you out as fast as possible. The goal is to get you stable and ready for whatever comes next. And if I can't sleep, Harlan said quietly, if I need to walk at night, then you walk, Chin replied without hesitation. We've got guys here who pace the halls at 3 a.m. We've got guys who sleep in the day and stay up all night. Trauma doesn't follow a schedule, and neither does healing. As long as you're not disturbing others, you do what you need to do. Something in Harlan's shoulders relaxed slightly, a tension releasing that he'd probably been carrying since they'd left the courthouse. He looked around the room again, this time seeming to actually see it rather than just catalog it for threats. Cantrell, who'd been standing quietly in the hallway, stepped into the doorway. Harlan, I need to get back to the office, but I wanted to make sure you were comfortable here before I left. Do you need anything? Harlan turned to her, and his weathered face held something that might have been gratitude. No, ma'am. I think I'm okay. Thank you for everything you did today. I didn't do much, Cantrell said. Judge Brennan did the heavy lifting. You stood by me, Harlan replied. You treated me like a person when you could have just treated me like a case number. That matters. Cantrell felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. She wasn't usually this emotional with clients, but there was something about this case, about this man, that had gotten through her professional defenses. You have my card. If you need anything, legal or otherwise, you call me. I mean that. I will, Harlan said. After Cantrell left, Chun gave Harlan a folder containing house rules, a schedule of activities, contact numbers for staff members, and information about the various services available. Your first medical appointment is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m., Chun said. I'll drive you if you want, or you can take the bus. The route stops right out front. I can take the bus, Harlan said. I know how to get around. Chun nodded. Dinner is at 6. You're welcome to join us in the cafeteria, or if you prefer to eat alone tonight, that's fine too. I can have a tray brought up. Harlan considered. I'll come down. Might as well start meeting people. Good, Chin said. I think you'll find most of the men here understand what you're going through. We've got guys from every conflict dating back to Korea. We've got active duty, guard, reserve, all branches. Everyone's got their own story, their own struggles. But we look out for each other. After Chin left, Harlan stood alone in his room for the first time. His room, private space, a door that locked from the inside. He walked to the bed and sat down carefully, the mattress firm beneath him, so different from the bench he'd slept on just nights before. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the photograph Judge Brennan had given him, studying the young faces frozen in that moment of relief and survival. Then he pulled out Kessler's business card and set both items on the small desk. Evidence of connection. Evidence that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed himself to be for so long. Harlan spent the afternoon unpacking what little he had, which consisted mostly of arranging emptiness. His belongings fit in 2 hands. The court summons he no longer needed, the photograph from Judge Brennan, Kessler's business card, and the clothes on his back. Chin had mentioned that donated clothing was available, fresh items that residents could choose from, but Harlan wasn't ready for that yet. Taking felt like admitting something he wasn't prepared to admit. Instead, he sat at the desk and looked out the window at the garden. The man with the prosthetic leg had finished harvesting tomatoes and now sat on a bench, his face turned toward the late afternoon sun. Another resident had joined him, and though Harlan couldn't hear their conversation through the glass, he could see the ease between them, the comfort of 2 people who understood each other's silences. At 5:30, Harlan stood and smoothed his shirt, though no amount of smoothing could remove the wrinkles or the stains. He looked at himself in the small mirror mounted above the desk and saw what everyone else had seen in the courthouse lobby that morning. a man weathered by time and circumstance, a man who looked defeated even when he was standing straight. He wondered if that would ever change, if healing could touch surfaces as well as depths. The cafeteria was already filling when he arrived, men of various ages gathering at long tables, their conversations creating a low hum of sound that felt almost like white noise. The room smelled of roasted chicken and vegetables, simple food, but abundant, and the warmth of the space wrapped around him like a blanket. Chun spotted him from across the room and waved him over to a table where 4 other men sat. "Gentlemen, this is Harlan Vickers. He's joining us today. Harlan, these are some of the residents. This is Frank, Jorge, William, and that quiet one at the end is Thomas." Frank was the oldest, probably in his 70s, with white hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Jorge looked to be in his 40s, stocky and broad-shouldered, with tattoos visible on his forearms. William was younger, maybe 30, with a nervous energy that manifested in constant small movements. Thomas, at the far end, had the 1,000-yard stare Harlan recognized from mirrors and memories. "Sit down," Frank said, gesturing to an empty chair. "You look like you've had a day." "You could say that," Harlan replied, sitting carefully. Frank laughed, a warm sound. "We've all had days. That's why we're here." He pushed a basket of bread toward Harlan. "Eat. Chin's wife cooks on Wednesdays. She makes the best roast chicken in the city." The food was served family-style, platters passed around the table, each man taking what he wanted. Harlan took small portions, his appetite still uncertain, his stomach not yet trusting that food would continue to be available. Old habits from lean times. "So what's your story?" Jorge asked, not unkindly. "Army? Marines?" "Army," Harlan said. 26 years. William whistled low. "That's a career. What did you do?" "Different things," Harlan said, falling back on the vague answer that had served him for years. "Classified shit," Jorge said knowingly. "I get it. I was intel. Can't talk about half of what I did either. It's frustrating sometimes, not being able to explain where the scars came from." Thomas spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and rough from disuse. "The scars people can't see are worse than the ones they can." The table went silent for a moment, everyone recognizing the truth in those words. Then Frank cleared his throat and changed the subject. "So Harlan, you garden and all? We got those beds out back. Always looking for people to help." "I've never tried," Harlan admitted. "Spent most of my life making things dead, not keeping them alive." "Good a time as any to learn," Frank said. "Plants don't judge. They just need water and sun and someone to care if they live or die. Sometimes that's enough." After dinner, the men moved to the television lounge, but Harlan excused himself and went back to his room. The walls felt closer than they had earlier, the space shrinking as darkness fell outside the window. He tried lying on the bed, but his body rejected the softness, his muscles remembering harder surfaces, his mind cataloging the room's vulnerability. By 9 o'clock, he was pacing. By 10, he was standing at his door, looking out into the hallway. By 11, he was walking the building, learning its rhythms, its sounds, its safety patterns. He wasn't the only one. He passed Thomas on the second-floor landing, the younger man sitting on the stairs with his head in his hands. They nodded to each other, two night wanderers recognizing kinship. On the first floor, he found Marcus Chun in his office, working late on paperwork. The director looked up as Harlan appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep," Chun said. Statement, not question. "Too quiet," Harlan replied. "Too safe. My brain doesn't know what to do with safe anymore." Chun gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit if you want. I'm just doing budget reports. Company would be welcome." Harlan sat, grateful for the permission to not be alone, but not be social either. They existed in comfortable silence for several minutes, Chun working, Harlan simply being present. Eventually Chun set down his pen. "I was Navy," he said, corpsman attached to the Marines. Did 3 tours in Iraq. Got out in '09. Spent 2 years homeless before I found this place. Not as a director, as a resident. Room 14, second floor." Harlan looked at him with new understanding. "You lived here." "For 18 months, Chun confirmed. "Best 18 months of my life, because they taught me how to live again. how to trust that tomorrow would come and food would be there and people wouldn't hurt me while I slept. Basic things most people take for granted. He paused. The woman who ran this place back then, she saved my life. When she retired 5 years ago, I took over. Figure I could pay forward what she gave me. Does it get easier? Harlan asked. The nights. The feeling like you're always waiting for something bad to happen. It gets different, Chin said carefully. Not easier exactly, but different. You learn to recognize the false alarms. You learn that racing heart doesn't always mean danger. You learn to breathe through the panic instead of running from it. Some guys get there faster than others. Some never fully get there. But everyone gets somewhere better than where they started. Harlan nodded, absorbing this. How long before I can visit the memorial again? Chin smiled slightly. You can visit tomorrow if you want. The judge said you have standing permission, remember? Besides, this isn't prison. You're free to come and go. Just let someone know if you're leaving after 10, so we don't worry. I want to go tomorrow night, Harlan said. After the medical appointment. I need to tell them. The name's on the wall. Tell them I'm getting help. Tell them I'm trying. Chin's expression softened. They'd be proud of you. Whatever kept you away from help before, whatever guilt or shame or sense of unworthiness, they wouldn't want that for you. Brothers don't want their brothers to suffer. How do you know? Harlan asked, and the question carried the weight of years. Because I had the same conversation with names on a different wall, Chin replied, and I realized that honoring their memory didn't mean destroying myself. It meant living well enough for both of us, living the life they didn't get to live. They sat together in that office as midnight came and went, two men who understood each other's darkness because they'd each walked through their own. Outside, the city slept or pretended to. Inside, the Veterans Transition Center held space for men learning to be still, learning to rest, learning that safety wasn't a trap but a gift. The medical appointment at the VA hospital consumed most of the next morning. Harlan sat through examinations and evaluations, answered questions about pain levels and sleep patterns and intrusive thoughts, allowed nurses to take his blood pressure and doctors to probe old wounds that had healed crooked from lack of proper care. They documented everything. The shrapnel scars on his shoulder and thigh, the hearing loss in his left ear from too many explosions too close, the chronic pain that had become such a constant companion, he'd stopped noticing it. The psychologist was a woman named Dr. Amelia Reeves, perhaps 50, with gray streaking through her dark hair and eyes that had seen enough trauma stories to recognize the signs before Harlan even spoke. She didn't push, didn't demand, just created space for him to fill or not fill as he chose. Tell me about the nightmares, she said after they'd covered the basics. They're always the same, Harlan replied. I'm back in the jungle or the desert or the mountains, and I can hear my men calling for me, but I can't reach them. I run and run, but the distance never closes. I watch them die over and over, and I can't do anything to stop it. Do you have these dreams every night? Most nights. Sometimes I go a few days without them. Then they come back stronger, like they were waiting. Dr. Reeves made notes on her tablet. PTSD manifests differently in everyone, but what you're describing is consistent with survivor guilt and hypervigilance. The dreams are your mind's way of trying to process trauma. It couldn't process when it was happening. The running represents the helplessness you felt. The inability to reach your men represents your perceived failure to protect them. I did fail them, Harlan said flatly. 3 of my men died under my command. That's not perception. That's fact. Command doesn't mean omnipotence, Dr. Reeves replied gently. You led men into dangerous situations because that was the mission. The enemy killed them, not you. The circumstances killed them. The war killed them. But you've been carrying their deaths like they were your personal responsibility, like you had the power to prevent what happened. I should have seen it coming, Harlan insisted. I should have anticipated the ambush, should have chosen a different route, he trailed off, the list of should-haves too long to complete. Master Sergeant Vickers, how many missions did you run during your time with Delta Force? Harlan thought for a moment. Classified operations? Maybe 200. Maybe more. I stopped counting after a while. And on how many of those missions did you lose men? 3 missions. Total of 7 men over 12 years. Dr. Reeves leaned forward slightly. So out of 200 high-risk operations, you lost 7 men. That's a 96.5% success rate in the most dangerous work imaginable. Most commanders would consider that remarkable. But you focus on the 3.5%. Because those 7 men mattered, Harlan said, his voice rough. They had families. They had futures. They trusted me to bring them home. And you brought hundreds of others home, Dr. Reeves countered. How many men are alive today because of your decisions, your leadership, your skills? How many families still have fathers and brothers and sons because Master Sergeant Harlan Vickers did his job well? Harlan was quiet, the question settling over him like snow. He'd never considered it that way. Never tallied the lives saved against the lives lost. Never allowed himself to count the successes because the failures loomed so large. "I like to see you twice a week initially," Dr. Reeves said. "We'll work on cognitive behavioral therapy, help you reframe some of these thought patterns. I'm also going to recommend medication for the nightmares and anxiety. It won't fix everything, but it can help take the edge off while you do the deeper work." After the appointment, Harlan took the bus back to the transition center. The afternoon stretched before him, empty and full simultaneously. He found Frank in the garden, working among the raised beds with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing growth only damaged it. "Mind if I help?" Harlan asked. Frank looked up, squinting in the sunlight. "I'd welcome it. These weeds don't pull themselves." They worked side by side for over an hour, the rhythm of the task meditative. Frank talked occasionally, sharing bits of his own story. Vietnam, 2 tours, 40 years of struggling afterward, 3 failed marriages, and a son who wouldn't speak to him. But he'd been at the center for 2 years now, and things were better. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. "The trick is forgiving yourself," Frank said, pulling a stubborn root from the soil. "Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, but forgiving yourself for being human, for making mistakes, for surviving when others didn't." "That's a hard trick," Harlan observed. "The hardest," Frank agreed. "I'm still working on it. Probably will be until the day I die. But each day it gets a little less heavy. That's something." As evening approached, Harlan showered and changed into clean clothes from the donation room. A simple blue shirt and jeans that fit reasonably well. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw someone slightly different from the man who'd stood in the courthouse lobby just yesterday. Cleaner, certainly, but something else too. Something in the eyes that suggested maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. He told Chun he was going to the memorial, and the director simply nodded. "Be safe. Be back when you're ready." The walk to Riverside Park took 30 minutes, and Harlan used the time to steady his breathing, to prepare himself for the conversation he needed to have with names carved in stone. The park was quiet at twilight, the fading light painting everything in shades of amber and gray. The memorial stood at the center of a circular plaza, a black granite wall inscribed with names dating back decades. Harlan approached slowly, his eyes finding the section he knew by heart. 3 names among hundreds, but these 3 he'd touched so many times the stone was worn smooth beneath them. He placed his hand on the first name, Corporal Darius McKnight, 23 years old when he died, a kid from Georgia who'd dreamed of opening a restaurant after his service. "I'm sorry I haven't visited in a while," Harlan said quietly. "I'm sorry for a lot of things, but I'm trying now. I'm getting help. I'm in a place with other vets, people who understand. There's a psychologist and medication and people who actually want to help. I don't know if it'll work. I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try." He moved to the second name, Sergeant Lamar Whitfield, 31, married with 2 kids from Ohio. His hand traced the letters slowly. "Your kids are grown now. I looked them up a few years ago just to see. Your daughter's a nurse. Your son's a teacher. They're doing good, Lamar. They're living good lives. I think you'd be proud." The third name was harder. Staff Sergeant Nguyen Phan, 28, first-generation American whose parents had escaped Vietnam only to lose their son in another jungle decades later. Harlan's voice broke as he spoke. "I met a man yesterday who I saved a long time ago. He became a judge. He has a family, a career, a whole life because we did our job. I've been so focused on the missions that went wrong, I forgot about the ones that went right. I forgot that we saved people too, that we made a difference. Behind him, footsteps approached on the path. Harlan turned to see Officer Pritchard in civilian clothes, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Saw you from the street, Pritchard said. Thought you might want company. Or I can leave if you'd rather be alone. Company's fine, Harlan said. They stood together at the wall, drinking coffee as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. 2 men from different generations, different wars, different struggles, united by the common thread of service and the weight of memory. 3 months passed like water finding its level, settling into patterns that felt strange at first but gradually became familiar. Harlan attended his therapy sessions twice a week. The conversations with Dr. Reeves slowly chipping away at the fortress of guilt he'd built around himself. The medication helped quiet the nightmares, though they never disappeared entirely. Some nights he still woke gasping, but Chin had been right. It got different. The panic lasted minutes instead of hours. The daylight brought perspective instead of just exhaustion. He worked in the garden every morning, his hands learning the difference between destroying and nurturing. Frank became something like a friend, their conversations ranging from profound to mundane, both equally valuable. The tomatoes they'd planted together yielded fruit that tasted sweeter than anything Harlan remembered eating in years. The VA processed his benefits. Back pay appearing in an account Delgado helped him open. The amount staggered him, years of accumulated disability payments he'd never claimed. She helped him navigate the system, fighting through bureaucracy with the determination of someone who'd promised herself no more fathers will be lost to red tape. Judge Brennan kept his word. On a Saturday afternoon in early December, Harlan took the bus to the judge's home in the suburbs, a modest 2-story house with a well-kept yard. Brennan's wife Margaret answered the door, a woman with warm eyes and her husband's kind smile. She hugged Harlan like he was family, like she'd been waiting 29 years for this moment. The children were there too, all grown now with lives of their own. Catherine, the oldest, was an architect. Michael taught high school history. Sarah worked as a trauma surgeon. They gathered around their father and the man who'd made their existence possible, and the afternoon dissolved into stories and laughter and tears. We talk about you every Veterans Day, Catherine said. Dad tells the story of the jungle, of the team that appeared like ghosts and kept him alive. We grew up knowing our father was here because of brave men we'd never meet. And now here you are, real and sitting in our living room. I'm just glad he made a home, Harlan said simply. That's all we wanted, to get everyone home. But you didn't all make it home, Brennan said gently. And that's been eating at you ever since. Harlan nodded slowly. Working on that, sir. Little bit every day. That's all any of us can do, Brennan replied. Little bit every day. As winter settled over the city, Harlan found himself settling too. He moved from room 23 to a small efficiency apartment the center helped him secure, a transition space between full support and independent living. The apartment had a kitchen where he learned to cook simple meals. It had a bedroom where he gradually learned to sleep through the night more often than not. Officer Pritchard kept his promise, visiting the memorial with Harlan once a week. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just stood in companionable silence. Other veterans began joining them, a small informal gathering that became ritual. They brought folding chairs and thermoses of coffee. They shared stories about the names on the wall, keeping memories alive through the simple act of remembering together. Cantrell called monthly to check in, always pretending she needed legal updates, but really just wanted to know he was okay. He appreciated the pretense, the way it let him accept concern without feeling like a burden. She told him about her other cases, and sometimes he offered perspective that only someone who'd lived through the system could provide. On a cold evening in February, Harlan returned to the courthouse, not for trial, but as a guest. Judge Brennan had invited him to speak to a group of newly appointed judges about compassion and context in criminal justice. Harlan stood in the same courtroom where his life had changed, and he told his story to a room full of people who held others' fates in their hands. Every person who appears before you has a story, he said, his voice steady and clear. You might not always have time to hear it. You might not always be the person who knew them in a jungle 30 years ago. But you can look for the story. You can ask the questions. You can remember that laws exist to serve justice, and justice requires seeing people as people, not just as case numbers or charges. The judges listened with the intensity of students before a master teacher. After he finished, several approached him with questions, with thanks, with their own stories of veterans they'd encountered in their courtrooms. He realized that his presence here mattered not because of what he'd done decades ago, but because of what he represented now, proof that the system could work when people cared enough to make it work. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal. The garden at the transition center exploded with new growth, and Harlan spent his mornings there with Frank and a growing crew of residents who discovered the same peace in dirt and seeds that he had. They planted vegetables and flowers side by side, creating beauty and sustenance from soil that had lain dormant. One afternoon, as Harlan was tying up tomato plants, a young man approached him hesitantly. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, with the hollow eyes and uncertain movements of someone recently returned from war and struggling to find their place in peace. "They told me you might understand," the young man said. "I'm having trouble with everything. I can't sleep. I can't hold a job. My family doesn't get it. They keep telling me to move on, but I don't know how." Harlan set down his gardening tools and gestured to the bench where he'd sat so many times with Frank. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me about it." And so the cycle continued, the helped becoming the helper, the saved offering salvation to others who wandered in darkness. Harlan shared his story and listened to this young soldier's story. And in the listening, he found new purpose. Not replacing what he'd lost, not forgetting the men on the memorial wall, but honoring them by doing for others what had been done for him. That evening, he visited the memorial one more time. The gathering was larger now, maybe 15 veterans, ranging from Korea to Afghanistan, all united by the common language of service and sacrifice. They shared coffee and stories as the sun set over the city, and Harlan realized that he'd spent so long focusing on the 3 names he'd lost that he'd forgotten about the hundreds he'd saved, the communities he protected, the difference his service had made. He placed his hand on Corporal McKnight's name one more time. "We're okay," he said quietly. "You be proud of us. We're taking care of each other. We're remembering you. We're living the lives you didn't get to live, and we're trying to make them count." Officer Pritchard appeared beside him, as he did every week, with 2 cups of coffee. "Another good day," Harlan said, accepting the cup. "Another good day," Pritchard agreed. They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. 2 men who understood that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, that some wounds never fully closed, but could be tended with care and community and a simple act of showing up, day after day, for themselves and for each other. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment, or tell us about a veteran in your life who deserves recognition. Sometimes the heroes living on our streets just need someone to see them, to hear their story, to remember that service and sacrifice don't end when the uniform comes off. Every veteran deserves the chance Harlan got, the chance to heal, to be seen, to find their way home.